There are plenty of videos on YouTube assessing the geopolitics of various modern countries and regions. However, there aren't too many videos covering the geopolitics of the ancient world. In this video, we're going to cover the geopolitics of the Bronze Age Middle East / Eastern Mediterranean. While there are other parts of the world that have their own fascinating histories around this time period between 3300 BCE and 1200 BCE, the Middle East is by and large the area where we have the best records, and it also works as an interconnected system. As far as the name is concerned, the Bronze Age, well, it refers to, surprise surprise, bronze, which is made up of a combination of copper and tin. Keep in mind that tin was not particularly common at the time, and oftentimes had to be sourced in faraway lands, including one you may have heard of called England. Copper, while not as uncommon as tin, was still less common than iron, and was oftentimes found off of the island of Cyprus and a few other locations. Iron, which is the most common of all, requires higher temperatures to forge, which is why it was not widely used at this point in history. So, let's start off with the major regions. The four main regions of this ancient universe are the Fertile Crescent, Egypt, Anatolia, and Greece. The Fertile Crescent has the oldest recorded history, so we'll start off with this area. Today, Iraq and Syria by and large have negative connotations, but they were once the birthplace of civilization. Mesopotamia means the land between two rivers, those rivers being the Tigris and the Euphrates. These rivers provided not only fresh water, but also fertile soil, which is why they were home to some of the earliest cities, as well as the first writing system, cuneiform. The fertile soil provided a surplus of crops, such as wheat, to allow some people to enter other professions unrelated to food production, such as stonemasons, smiths, builders, priests, and scribes. Even food production got more complex with bakers, butchers, and fishermen. You all saw these new professions arising, the diversification of labor. Fish were so plentiful that some of the early Sumerian gods were oftentimes depicted as fishmen, mermen. The surplus of food and the diversification of labor caused by these rivers allowed large cities to emerge in what is now southern Iraq. Thus, Sumerian civilization was born. These cities were by and large not particularly large by modern standards, but in a world populated by cavemen, they were gigantic. The ancient Sumerian epic poem, the Epic of Gilgamesh, covers the relationship between the king of the city of Uruk, Gilgamesh, and the wild man Enkidu. For the first time, humanity was beginning to see itself as separate from nature. However, Mother Nature is kind of a bitch, and she gets the final say, the first and the last. It turns out that the Tigris and the Euphrates are prone to flooding. This can wreak havoc on cities and farms, which might explain why the people of this region had a cosmology that could oftentimes be pessimistic, including the myth of the Great Flood. Now, almost all of you are familiar with Noah's Ark. I'm assuming that many of you come from a region where Abrahamic religions dominate. Well, it turns out that the story of Noah's Ark is largely borrowed by a Sumerian tale that is quite similar, involving the Great Deluge. Now, the fedora-tipping neckbeards of r/atheism are correct to point out the literal inaccuracies of the book of Genesis involving Noah's tale are by and large, well, inaccuracies, but there is a watered-down, pun not intended, element of truth to this story, which is that the Tigris and Euphrates do involve flooding, and this probably inspired the tale. Now, this region was surrounded by fairly flat terrain, which made it easy for invading armies to conquer. Having two river systems rather than one made it more difficult for one political authority to wrest control over the entire Fertile Crescent for long. The Sumerians were eventually conquered by the Akkadians, who were a Semitic-speaking people. This is followed by a revival of Sumerian power, only to be followed by the Babylonians and then the Assyrians. The Babylonians further developed and refined the legal system and civic structure, taking over numerous city-states. The Assyrians continued this trend, albeit with substantially more brutality than previous empires, Controlling so many city-states was a difficult task, and the Assyrians did so by ethnically cleansing populations. Because much of this territory was inland, the Assyrian Empire did not suffer at the hands of the sea peoples as did other regions during the Bronze Age collapse. The Assyrians were by and large so successful at stabbing people that they managed to take over large swaths of the Hittite Empire's lands in the Levant. They also utilized the flatlands and tributaries of the rivers to push into what is now Iran. Along the way, they did this through extremely advanced, organized military and civic tactics, at least very advanced for their time. And as a result of this, the Assyrians survived a little bit longer after the collapse, unlike some other regions I could name. Now keep in mind that this region was by no means homogeneous. The two rivers and their tributaries resulted in various different cultures. There were very Semitic-speaking people groups such as the Chaldeans and Arameans, as well as non-Semitic people such as the Elamites. The disparate waterways prevented too much culture and tribal convergence at this early time. This may explain why city-states, tribes, and empires rose, as well as why it was done at such a rapid rate, with oftentimes quite distinct features. Each time some group defeated another group, it was seen as not only a victory for the people, but also the various gods that were worshipped by those people. This is unlike the next subregion, Egypt. Egypt is, by and large, the most famous of ancient civilizations. What makes Egypt so special is that it was clearly shaped by a distinct geography, namely the Nile River, that starts off in what is now called Lake Victoria as far south as what is now Tanzania, and empties into the Mediterranean Sea through the Nile River Delta. The Nile is arguably the longest river in the world, but it's not very navigable. South of Egypt lies a number of cataracts, which limit contact with sub-Saharan Africa. The only region of Africa with substantial contact with Egypt at the time was Nubia, in what is now Sudan. Small wooden ships could navigate the river north of what is now the city of Aswan. The river is excellent for irrigation though, even though it's pretty crappy for navigation. The river provides water for crops such as wheat, barley, and chickpeas, which could fuel a large-scale society. The rivers flood in a fairly predictable and less destructive manner than what we saw in the Tigris and Euphrates, which may explain why the Egyptians were more optimistic in their outlook than Mesopotamians, with even their underworld looking pretty nice. The Nile not only made it possible for Upper and Lower Egypt to unite, but also made it very easy for a central authority figure, the pharaoh, to take control over the entire region. This led to the mobilization of armies and mega projects during the Old Kingdom, most famously being the Pyramids of Giza, of course. During the New Kingdom, Egypt was able to expand into the Levant in what is now Israel, Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, and Syria. This led to a clash with Hittites, and the first recorded major battle in history, the Battle of Megiddo. Both sides claimed to be the winners, but it was most likely a bunch of BS propaganda, and in reality, the battle was a draw. Eventually, Egypt was attacked by the Sea Peoples, and while it survived better than other regions, it could no longer exert itself abroad, eventually being subsumed by the Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and so forth. Next on the list is Anatolia, in what is oftentimes called Asia Minor, and what is now referred to as the Asian part of the Republic of Turkey. Here we once had the Hittite Empire. The Hittites are by and large lost to time, and only weird nerds like me are familiar with them, but I'll talk about them anyway. The Hittites were an Indo-European group of people, coming from either central Anatolia or the steppes of what is now Ukraine. They used bronze tools made from tin and copper, combined with the wheel and the domestication of the horse. Keep in mind that horses dominated much of the Central Asian steppe, and the wheel is very well used on flat terrain. Now, Anatolia is very mountainous, but it's likely that the horses and wheels were utilized for transportation to flood into Asia Minor. And not only did they flood into Asia Minor, they were able to flood into what is now the Levant in coastal Syria and Lebanon. They also managed to secure what is now the Greek island of Cyprus, most likely to 1. Fight off the Sea People pirates from Crete, as well as to gain access to copper. Eventually they clashed with Egypt, but they eventually collapsed and their capital was razed to the ground by fire after a long period of decline. The details are still up for debate. Now, keep in mind that their legacy still lives on, as the Indo-Europeans ended up becoming a pretty big deal. The last major civilizational region is Mycenaean Greece. Previously in Greece, or what is now called Greece, there was a civilization known as the Minoans on the island of Crete, which was destroyed partially due to volcanic activity. This shifted power into the mainland of what is now called Greece, with an Indo-European group of tribes that formed city-states known as the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans were not a unified state, but rather a group of several kingdoms who nonetheless had some shared cultural traits, despite their warring and infighting and the three different tribes that contributed to their shared quasi-civilization. This can be seen with the story of the Trojan War, which, if it was true, was probably not over the love of Helen, but rather maritime trade routes into the Black Sea. It was here where the Bronze Age collapse was the most destructive at the hands of the ever mysterious Sea Peoples, as there was so much access to the coast. Now, while the Bronze Age collapsed into the Dark Ages, civilization would be reforged during the Iron Age with better tools and weapons, as man managed to forge at higher temperatures. The classical Greek states, such as Athens, would look to their Mycenaean past with reverence and a great deal of folklore, including the famous stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which provided the Greeks with a unified identity despite having warring city-states during the classical age. The Indo-European Hittites collapsed, but other Indo-European peoples would dominate not only Europe, but also India and Persia. Speaking of Persia, they would rise to be one of the most tolerant and forward-thinking pluralistic empires of the ancient world, and prove to be more benevolent than the Assyrians and Babylonians. Egypt had certainly passed its days of yonder, but they would have successive golden ages under the Persians, Greeks, Arabs, and others. In the Levant, the Phoenicians would set up the first colonies around the Mediterranean, while the Israelites would set up the foundations for Abrahamic religions. The collapse of the Bronze Age was brutal, but in the aftermath of the darkness, humanity saw the light, with the rise of the Axial Age, and the coming forth of more pluralistic, interconnected societies in an interconnected and pluralistic world.